I know there's a lot of excitement in the air for this lecture, so I feel it. It's fantastic. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you, and especially those of you who are in the simulcast. So before we begin, I know you know what I'm going to ask you. Please turn off anything that makes noise, or rings, or barks, or squeaks, or whatever. So tonight we're really trying to escape winter, which is just outside. I think it's really rude that we still have it. March is really coming in like a lion. But I'm really happy that we can all gather and explore these luscious gardens while we wait for spring to really arrive. Soon enough, our magnificent gardens will be welcoming fragrant blooms. We do have the very first daffodils have already bloomed here, I'm happy to say. But I'm inviting you to immerse yourself in our greenhouse because March is Orchid Month. And there's a lot of opportunities to go to classes in orchid care or in floral design using orchids. And while you're admiring the orchids in our greenhouses, I hope you'll also stop and take a look at the exhibition Fragrant Botanicals, which features, yes, it is really good, that features plants that are used to distill for fine perfumes. And of course, the reason why we're doing that show is because we have the special exhibition in the Dacha that's called Perfume and Seduction, which showcases these fabulous perfume containers that are both in Hillwood's collection, and they also come from a wonderful European collection called Givaudan. So I imagine you won't be surprised that we are doing a whole lecture series in concert with Perfume and Seduction that begins on March 28th. So I know I'm preaching to the choir, but our members, of course, have the opportunity to visit our exhibitions and our greenhouse displays over and over, and you all receive admission discounts, of course, for the programs as well as the shop, and I know a number of you have taken advantage of that benefit this evening. And next week, our members will receive a special discount in the newly opened Merriweather Cafe. So the Merriweather Cafe actually opens to the public next Friday. So I hope you will all come see it because it's totally refurbished, new menu. It's really wonderful. So tonight we have the pleasure of exploring the luscious and meticulously crafted gardens of Bunny Mellon with garden historian Linda Jane Holden. In addition to the absolutely stunning new book, The Gardens of Bunny Mellon, Linda is the author of President's Gardens, and she's a contributing author to White House History, which was published by the White House Historical Association. Linda first became aware of Mrs. Mellon's contributions to landscape design while working in the White House during the Reagan administration. The Gardens of Bunny Mellon is available, of course, in the shop upstairs, and Linda would be delighted to sign copies following the lecture. So please join me in welcoming Linda Jane Holden.
Hello. Had to get my voice adjusted to the sound system first. Thank you so much. It's such a treat for me to be here. I have to confess and tell you, about a year ago when I was finishing my manuscript, I wondered if anyone would even be interested in reading it. My brother-in-law reminded me recently how, he's like, Linda, it's amazing. Some people are actually interested in reading what you wrote. And I said, how about that? It's nice. It's nice. I do want to thank Kate for having me here, and Erin, Lori, who's been fantastic to work with, Mona Lisa Johnson, great at organizing me and getting me here. And I also have some very special guests that I'd like to introduce. Actually, all of you are fabulous, and I appreciate you coming. And I wish that we could introduce every single one of you, and so maybe at the end you can meet somebody, because there's some really wonderful people here. But I also want to introduce a couple people up on the front row who are very near and dear to me. Number one, do you want to stand up when I call your name, please? You don't have to, but Tony. He's just going to do. Thank you, Tony. Tony has become a great friend over the years. He's been very, very kind, patient, and the thing about Tony, he doesn't forget anything. He knows the names of all the paintings, all the works of art, all of it. It's just, he always just blows my mind away. Next, Eleanor, would you please stand? Eleanor Crane is the head volunteer at Oak Spring Garden Foundation. She also happens to be married to the guy who wrote the foreword for the book, Sir Peter Crane, and appreciate that. And Eleanor's done a wonderful job trying to make Bunny Mellon's dream come true out there at Oak Spring, making it a place for scholars and educators to come and study. And then from my own family, I have Beck Visat and my daughter Caroline that are here with me. And it's always nice to have your family in the audience to, go with your mother to work day kind of thing. And then this lady up here, this is Bunny Mellon, as you may or may not know, I don't know. I was told by my brother at one time, he said, Linda, not everybody knows who she is. So here she is. And this is a picture of her as I remember her. And I like to remember her. She's famous for the saying, nothing should be noticed, which is really not true, where people don't really understand that. And actually, it's an expression of her aesthetic, her how she created harmony in peaceful, lovely places. And she's also would tell people when they were in the garden to look for the details. And now, whereas the garden isn't really open today to so many people, that's the point of the book, is that you can be in her gardens anytime, any day that you want, just by paging through the different pages, and you can see all her gardens. But you're going to have to look for the details. I did when I was writing it, and there's still a lot more to be seen. Bunny Mellon has been described in many ways as a legend, a 20th century tastemaker, a philanthropist, and even as the last empress. Well, indeed, she was all of these things. She just wanted to be known as a gardener, preferring to climb the arborist ladder, not the social ladder. When I first met Mrs. Mellon at her farm at Oak Spring, she emphasized the importance of knowing what is worthwhile in life, and commented that she enjoyed meeting people who were involved in interesting projects. The gardens she created at the White House and for her family and friends, to me, are important. They are interesting and inspirational. After her death, I read in her garden journals that she had wanted to write a book about gardening, but it didn't have the time. You can either have the gardens or write the book, not both. Then came the auction of the decade, when all her personal effects went on the auction block in New York City, and the endless chatter about her jewels and the couture and the art collections, the real estate and bank accounts, all of which I felt misrepresented the talented woman I had known. And I began to believe that the time had come to shift the conversation towards what she really loved, her passion, her love of gardening, her pursuit of beautiful, appropriate, harmonious garden spaces, and write that book for her. It is this endeavor that became The Gardens of Bunny Mellon. This is Little Jumping Joan. This is Bunny Mellon, not really, but this is the way she felt when she was in the garden, so joyful and happy and full of life. This is Albemarle. It's the family estate that her mom and dad built in Princeton, New Jersey. Albemarle was named after Albemarle, Virginia, Albemarle County, where her father's family was from. You can see the beginning elements of her aesthetic starting to come alive there at her family home. This is also a place of first for her. It's where she had her first garden. She asked her dad if she could have a garden, and he stepped off a little space back behind the dining room. And she told me how he visited her there every day. And I thought that was really neat to think that a dad would take that time, but also told me that she was in her garden every day, even as a child. Here's another first. This is her very first building project there on the grounds of Albemarle, and you can see her style developing with the weathered-looking exterior. She learned from her father to whitewash stone walls and concrete, and to give it that timeless look. She wanted things to look old, but not be old. You can see her favorite color palette coming forth. and the way she loved to outline flower beds with boxwood and their irregular stepping stones. These are all features that she would incorporate into gardens throughout her life. This is not Bunny Mellon. This is, the guy in the middle, but this actually is a picture is up here so that we can focus on the gentleman to the right. This is Ervin Williams, who was the head gardener at the White House. Now, Bunny brought Mr. Williams to the White House in 1961 when President Kennedy asked her to redesign the Rose Garden. He'd been working with the National Park Service, so he was one of the ones that was in the car driving around with her and Perry Wheeler, finding trees that they would dig up and bring back to the White House. He was also working at the White House when I arrived there in the 1980s. And I worked in the West Wing where I had access to the gardens, and I didn't work in the gardens, but I managed to be in the gardens as much as possible. And he kind of took me under his wing, and he started to explain to me about the gardens in a horticultural and historic and design context. And I often felt that we were standing on holy ground the way he described them to me. He was a wonderful, kind, gentle-spoken man. He just passed away last November. He was 92. And if you ever asked her, in the morning, you'd say, well, good morning, how are you? And he'd always give you a weather report. And I always remember thinking we were on the dry side of things, that thing. And even when there had been a lot of rain, I remember saying, Mr. Williams, it's just rained and rained and rained all weekend. No, Linda, if you dig down in that soil, it's still dry. And I said, all right. He was a delight, and he really took me under his wing. And he's the one who described Mrs. Mellon to me for the very first time. And he always, in every conversation with these grounds are the work of Mrs. Paul Mellon, or Mrs. Mellon for short. He never called her Bunny. This is the library where Tony hangs out every day. And so this is I like to call it the upper room. It's very important. It's where she has a lot of her books. This is the table where she liked to sit and look at books. There's also a seating area nearby she used. This is the Rothko painting. When I first met her, it was right here in this setting. And I remember thinking how the whole space seemed to light up around her. It was beautiful. But this wall has a story. It's a lovely stone wall, and thick and solid. But she was a very aware of challenges, whether it was building or gardening, and she was very solution-oriented and always trying to find the right answer to the problem. So when this wall was almost done, the stonemason told me that she came by one day and said, it's just not quite right. It needs to be about a foot wider. So we had to tear it all down and start over again. But he got it right, Now, I don't know, you may or may not know who this is. Some people don't know. Last lecture I showed this, and some people came up later and said, I didn't know who that was. So this is Aubert de Givenchy, who liked to vacation with her many places. They went to Mount Vernon together. This is in Antigua. He was at all of her homes, and she likewise at his homes in France. I got to know him a couple years ago when we chatted about gardening with Bunny Mellon. He was actually the beginning of the whole French part for me. When I went to Paris, this is his home, his dining room, at the end of the salon in the first floor on Rue Grenelle in Paris, in the left bank, and the garden is just beyond the windows. And he just passed away about a year ago, and he would have an intimate setting for about 4, and the guest of honor got the view of the garden, and that was me that day. And so I got to sit and view the garden, and it is kind of a treat to have had Givenchy, hold your chair for you and help you around, but this is where we wined and dined and talked about gardening, and what a treat. He was the height of courtesy, and he was a man of ritual, and it was quite a learning opportunity to be around him. This is image most people look at, and it's just so iconic. You know, it's Bunny Mellon in this setting. Her alley has become very, world renowned. But I look at this, and the more I studied beyond getting to know her and learning about her, what I see, what she's doing, when she's walking down this pathway, she's heading home. She's leaving the greenhouse and going into her garden. But notice how the gravel walkway is even decorated. She painted the interior floors of her house with paint. But at the exterior paths were painted with shadow and light. And obviously, with the moving of the sun, there was always something new to see, which she was always aspiring towards. And the play of the sun, whether it was on the walkway or the walls, there's always had something new to look for, something to take notice of. But this alley, when she's walking down, she's on either side are Mary Potter crabapples that are pleached on the framework above. At the family home in Albemarle, her father had transplanted apple trees along the driveway to the family home. And she was driven by these apple trees every day going to school and back. And she was really enraptured. That's not too harsh a word. I mean, it's strong a word. She loved these apple trees. She wrote about them. She memorized the shapes of the trees, the knobs, the structure, the limbs, even how the sun came down on them in the different seasons, the shadows in the winter, the fruit in the fall, the flowers in the spring. So in my mind, when she was walking down here, she was at home. In her childhood home, she was near her family, her father, who she cherished. So this is, her bringing her childhood with her forward. Here's the same view, but going the opposite direction, where it's leading into the library. Into the greenhouse, the central pavilion. And the gardeners would call it snow and spring when the wind kicked up and the blossoms would unfurl. This is one more view of it, but what's interesting is the foreground of this view, and you can see the trompe-l'oeil. And this is important too, because where she didn't ever want to waste anything. And she had a lot of stuff, and she needed to figure out good places to store it. So behind these cupboards are shelving. So you open the cupboards, and they conceal shelving that she could store a lot of her garden gear. And of course, they had this fantastic French trompe-l'oeil on top of them. This is the Schlumberger finial that is now in St. Petersburg on display. So if you want to fly down to Florida, you can go and see it. It is a Dutch master's representation that shows the idea that life is fleeting. The grass withers, the flowers fade. The flowers in this arrangement are from all through the life of the flowers. Some are wilting, some are in fresh bloom. But that's what it is to represent, and it stood above the central pavilion of the greenhouse for all to see. It was kind of a landmark symbol. This is a picture of the lower terrace. Now, if any of you have your book, your Gardens of Bunny Mellon, if you take the jacket cover off, you're going to see this picture that is part of the case. And Mrs. Mellon liked to have a surprise in the garden. So the book is designed to remind you of that. So when you pull the jacket off, it's a surprise to see a picture under the jacket. So you can also have different cover out in your book, depending on whatever mood you're in any day. But this is the one that was put on the cover, and it's the little wishing well and the lower terrace. Now, the little, sometimes you know how mortar chips and brick and stone, and you get these little crevices. Well, one time the gardener filled those crevices in, because you want to keep everything tip-top shape, maintenance. And she came along and she's like, why is all this mortar here? Why did you fill this in? And he's like, why wouldn't I, And she said, no, dig it back out, chip it back out again, because the critters need a place to go. So she wanted, she just wanted to protect the little critters, so they had places to hide. When she was arranging designing a flower bed, she would often take a single stem and then study the varying shades and tints in each flower blossom. And she would use that to create a design. And that's what makes the sweeping, harmonious views of her garden that I know I enjoy. And it gives that peaceful, lasting ambiance that I think most of us appreciate about her. And so this is how she would coordinate. This is her backyard, filled with a garden. That's the house straight ahead on the southern end of the garden. The guest houses are to the west. And then there are like a central path. This picture is not right on center, but there are 3 different terraces, and she divided them up into different parterres. And so there's always something changing and new in each of the parterres. This is Antigua, and she loved the greenhouses. This is like on the left is like more of like a conservatory that opened from the dining room. To the right is a working greenhouse, and then down below is an outdoor pool. She loved to grow the little herb trees, and they came in handy when she wasn't feeling well, under the weather. There was a time where she had, some operation. So this is a great way for her to be in the garden without being in the garden. And it's something that she learned in France and then brought to the U.S. And I think that we can give her credit for populating these beautiful topiaries throughout our country. The first myrtle slip that she was given came from Robert Fisher at Mount Vernon. And she took it home and then propagated it. And now, there are many, many more. This is Trinity Episcopal Church in Upperville, Virginia. It is in continuous use, and she designed and built this church. The story goes that this is the 3rd church to sit on this site, and the 2nd church was ridden with termites, and the parishioners came to Mr. Mellon and asked him if he would consider giving a donation to a new church building, and they showed him their plans for a red brick church and all, and he said, "I'll tell you what, if you let me pay for it, then you'll let me design it." And they said, "Deal." And so Mrs. Mellon, of course, did the design, and it's beautiful, lovely, lovely building. And when you go inside, it's like a garden carved in wood and stone, and it is a joy to worship there. There's something, the stonemasons that came from the National Cathedral, and the stained glass also was installed by those artisans, and then local craftsmen from the Upperville area worked on it. Here's another, this is their New York City house, and what you have here is where there were 2 townhouses side by side, and she took them down, raised them, and then built one, and then it created a terrace, which was like unheard of in New York City to have such great terrace, open space. But it created a problem because the side of the house next door was exposed, and so she covered it in this treillage, which is just magnificent. Here's another problem she solved, this is in Nantucket, and she used these wooden trees to study the shadows and the light before she would plant a tree. And she would park these around whatever property where she wanted to plant. Well, in Nantucket, it was a problem. They did study the trees, they planted them, but nothing would live. So she finally decided just to use the wooden trees as permanent trees. And so they were designed on the model of the hawthorn tree. She loved the hardy orange and the hawthorn because they're a great place for the birds to nest and to hide. So that's what they're doing here, rearranging the branches to create this permanent view. And then, so this is where I first got to know Mrs. Mellon. This is the rose garden, and this is Solangiana, and this is the Oval Office, the view there by the corner. She told me the funniest story that this is the south border that runs down from the garden, that when they were marking out the garden one day, she said that she and Mr. Williams decided that it was 18 inches too short, too narrow. And so I remember saying, well, what did you do? And she said, well, Mr. Williams went up to the G-men, the government men, she called them the G-men, and And, well, she said to me, Linda, you worked in the White House. You know what the G-men are, right? And I said, yeah, I know what the G-men are. And she said, well, we asked the G-men if they would just move the markers over another 18 inches. And they told her no. And I find that incredible that someone would tell her no. And, but they did. And so I remember saying, well, what did you do? And she said, well, Mr. Williams and I, we just sat there on the colonnade outside the Oval Office, and we waited for the G-men to go to lunch. And I said, and what happened when they were at lunch? And she said, well, Mr. Williams went over and just moved the marker. And she said, we got our, she always gave credit to everybody else. She said, we got our 18 inches the Ervin Williams way, real quietly, you know? And, but this, you see the green pillow box and the Kingsville box that she loved. They were really special to her. This is a view of the Rose Garden during the Reagan years. And the lawn, you know, Kennedy wanted a lawn that could hold 1,000 people, but he loved grass. He didn't want anyone messing with his grass, and he was always a constant problem. And he would tell his visitors that they could stand in one spot for 2 minutes, and then they had to move to another spot. And it was kind of funny. There you see the, you know, she loved jewelry, the Schlumberger exhibitions and things like that. Well, she put some diamonds in this garden. These are the Katherine crabapple trees, 5 on each bed. And they're surrounded with diamonds in Santolina. So I like the way she incorporated her jewels into it. And then the box with that sweeps through it. When I was back in the 80s, when I was working there and talking with Mr. Williams, the names like Solangiana and Katherine and Green Pillow and Kingsville, they all became part of my everyday vocabulary, my vernacular. And that's also the time during those years I gave birth to my first child. And I wanted to name her a lovely, beautiful name. Solangiana was too hard to say, so we named her Katherine. And recently she's like, yes, Mom, I know I'm named after a tree. It's like, you are. It's funny how things get into your brain, you don't always even realize it. And then this, you all probably know, this is President Kennedy's gravesite, but maybe what you don't know is that Mrs. Mellon designed this. She incorporated facets of the Oval Office because it was his highest achievement by virtue of the terrace, you know, the elliptical terrace, his speech, more Solangianas, more crabapples, the osmanthus hedge like is in the Rose Garden, and then the stone, the granite. She said the granite had been quarried in Cape Cod, but I talked to Michael Painter, who had been the architect with Carl Warnecke, who just had designed this initially. And I said, so, Mr. Painter, is that really true? And I said, I've gone to Cape Cod quite a bit, and I don't think I've ever seen stone quarried there. And he said, no, he said, she bought a barn that had this paint granite foundation, and it had it all trucked down to the farm. And then she had it cut according to size. And it wasn't just chipped away and chiseled. It was designed and then drawn on another plan and numbered. Each of those stones is numbered on the stone and on the plan. So if when they're pulled up to do, you know, the excavation or work on the eternal flame, they can put everything back in perfect place. That's a millstone or grindstone that is there with the eternal flame. Robert Kennedy chose this site also, and what he did, this was a site that was considered not usable in the cemetery. But you can see why they wanted it. It's on the axis. It's just below the hill. Robert E. Lee's house, it's a historical access. So he secured his brother's place in history by doing so. This is something that turned up that we came across. It's in the old cemetery there at Oak Spring. And another thing that she did, you know, she was very thorough in her work. And she made prototypes all the time of things. And this, if you look closely, can you guess what it is a prototype of? Yeah, there it is. It's pretty cool. Yeah. This is Givenchy's house in France, and it's about an hour and a little bit outside Paris. He spent his weekends there, and she helped him with the gardens here. The traceries down to the one side. He got that idea from a Benedictine monastery, Venice, and loved the way they used that on the borders of the axial path. And he even asked the monks, could he borrow their idea? And they said yes. But they created a vegetable garden here, a potager, and she helped him with that. He told me some really funny stories. One of them was, he said that when they were together and they were talking about this, she said, Hubert, that forest, that stand of trees, it has to come down. And he said, Linda, I said, this is incredible. She's telling me to tear down a stand of trees. And he said, I just couldn't believe it. And I said, what did you do? And he said, I didn't tear them down. He said, I just left them there. And he said, he was really glad because a couple days later she called him. And she said on the phone, she'd gone home, and she said, Hubert, remember that stand of trees I told you to tear down? He's like, yes, Bunny. She said, well, I've been thinking that you shouldn't tear them down and cut them down. And he said, oh, can you imagine if I'd cut down all the trees, what it would cost? He was so concerned about what it would cost him to replace them all. And he said, I told her, Bunny, we must go slowly. No hasty decisions. And she didn't really make hasty decisions, but it did then. This is kind of where I got started in on this book in a different way. This is the Potager du Roi. And at Versailles, of the King's Vegetable Garden, Louis XIV had this built. Jean-Baptiste de la Cantonais, Tony taught me all about him for many years, many conversations about him. And this garden was designed so that they could cover the tables of Versailles, all the people that lived there, and they had to feed all these people. And so they had to produce all the fruits and vegetables for the king's table. It's open to the public. You can go there today and have a wonderful tour. This is where Givenchy took her to see when he had sold his Givenchy house, and he became the president of the World Monument Fund. And this is at the top of the projects that needed restoration, and he brought her here. And one Saturday, after they had visited the Versailles Market, which is a great place to go, and she was intrigued because all this is where these tall espaliers are, and she had been learning about that and studying that and playing with that herself, and so she was just mystified. She wrote a really sweet article about the first time she came here and saw these espaliers and going through the old tunnels, the figueries where they had kept the fruits. And what ended up happening here was she and Mr. Mellon supported the restoration of the Central Basin, and then the gate, that the Fordring Gate that Louis XIV, it's the original gate, he would walk through every day. There are plaques by the gate and the fountain that mark their contribution. And that's another funny story. Givenchy told me that he called her one day and on the telephone, and he said she and Paul were at Oak Spring, and he said they were having cocktails. I'm like, okay. And he talked to her and said, had there been a decision, do they want to contribute to any of the garden? And she said, Paul and I want to contribute to all of it. And he said, well, we will put a marker there for you. And she said, oh, no. We don't want anyone to know what we've done. We just don't want any attention at all. And he said, Bunny, I have to do something. He said, if I don't, he said, they're going to wonder where I got all this money, and I don't want to go to jail. And I thought that was a funny thing, imagining him in jail, And anyway, so I said, I've seen the markers, and there they were. Yeah, they're there to mark it. But people they don't really know about her. You have to look for the details because it's not really known. At least it wasn't. I also wondered about Mr. Mellon. Where does he come into all of this? Because Oak Spring was really a horse farm. He, for the equestrian, he was fox hunting and he was racing and he was breeding. And the garden's a little nugget in the midst of all of this. And I found a lot of his poetry that the librarian shared with me. And we'll just read this one aloud. Mr. Mellon, I should tell you, he wrote this when the Herbal Society was coming, it was in the 60s, I believe, when they were coming to Oak Spring, and it was a rainy afternoon, but they were coming for a tour, and of course they weren't going to miss that tour. And so you imagine all these women there on this sodden day. It says, "A welcome to Oak Spring, pleased as I am to welcome you. My thumb was never green, it's true, and horticultural knack and lore will pass me by forevermore. My county seat is on a horse, and though I love the land, of course, I have a horse's point of view, and like a horse I favor too. Clover and bluegrass deeply growing, green of spring and summer's mowing. But Bunny has a magic touch, and well we know there isn't much of anything on earth that grows from mighty oak to tiny rose. Eludes her touch from bloom to root. Her heart is a gardening computer, while in her head there's a whole college comprising horticultural knowledge. Now she will lead you on a tour of fragrant bowers and fine manure, through gardens gay with blooms and shrubs and tender shoots and pots and tubs, through palaces of crystal glass with tropic fruits and flowers en masse, through scents and sights and bright profusion, through Latin names to my confusion. Now it's my very happy duty to urge you toward these scenes of beauty, and should some beasts obscure your view, forgive us, we grow horses too." So that kind of tells you where he was in all of this, how he just loved and appreciated all her garden efforts. And there's the Gardens of Bunny Mellon. And it's something that if you have, that you can always visit the garden anytime that you want. Okay. Did anyone have a question? Yes.
I don't know if I've seen enough pictures to understand. What do you think her source of inspiration was? And I've seen pictures of many gardens, French, English, Italian. I don't see any of that in any of the photographs that we've been shown today. So what was her philosophy and what was her inspiration?
Okay, so the question is, what was Mrs. Mellon's inspiration in gardens? She believed in inspiration. She always looked for inspiration. That was one reason she delayed starting the Rose Garden with President Kennedy, because she was searching for the right inspiration. And that's when she saw the magnolias at the Frick Museum in New York one day, just walking. She saw that. And so all of a sudden it just clicked that she could see that same thing going on with the magnolias against there. I think it's a pale pink building against, because there was all that white at the White House, and she wanted to soften it. So she was searching for just the right thing, not to cover it up, but so something that the sunlight could filter through to the plants beneath. And so it would hold the snow, the tufts of snow in the winter. And so she found that inspiration there. For the East Garden, she went into the world, one of the worlds that she also loves. She loves children's stories, storybook world. And Alice in Wonderland is what she used there for that. Givenchy for the Potager de Bois, the inspiration was George Washington's Mount Vernon and his gardens there. Givenchy built pavilions similar to the ones that George Washington had, and designed it in that way. So she also felt that everyone should find inspiration in something as guidance. And some people have said to me, well, I just can't begin to replicate her gardens. And she would never expect anyone to replicate her garden. She would want you to find something that you were inspired by. A little something, maybe it was one of her little herb trees or something like that. A flower bed of a flower that you would create your own color palette with, and then implement that into your own garden, whatever you have. And so that's how she would always, inspiration is like the guiding light, her guiding light. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I had a question about the plant palette you mentioned. She had a palette color colors she used very often? What kind of plants were those made up of?
Oh, the exact specific plants?
Just generally, yeah.
Oh, well, she would use a lot of common plants, a lot of violets, violas, things like that. And of course, everything changed through the seasons. And she loved trial and error. She was willing to try different plants, and if they didn't work, out they came. And but she didn't search out the rare things. She enjoyed those things, but she was very much interested in what normal. At Oak Spring, she would line the pathways with apple cordons, little apple trees, that were just. I mean, it's just so delightful. And then you see these apples just hanging at your ankles. I'd never seen anything like that before. Thickets of lavender, things like that. She loved the blues and yellows. One garden, one of the down on the lower terrace, Mr. Melon's racing colors were yellow and gray, and so she tried to evoke that with flax and things like sun. And then she had a lot of seasonal flowers that we all love, sunflowers, things like that. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
Did she have any suggestions for how to keep the deer and the animals from eating everything?
Yes, you build a wall. And you put a big gate on it.
Question for the folks in simulcast.
Okay.
Can you repeat that?
How do we keep out the deer? Did she have a special plan to keep out the deer? And I said to build a wall. Yes.
At the White House, she did the East Garden, is that right? What was it like before?
It had been done by Beatrix Farron for the Wilsons, for Mrs. Wilson. The first Mrs. Wilson had started the plan, and then Edith Wilson finished it because the first Mrs. Wilson passed away from Bright's disease, and so it was in that era, that theme. It was, to me, it was very thickly planted, and so it stayed that way for many years until. And then actually Mrs. Johnson is the one that brought her in. The Kennedys had the plan, the idea to do it. President Kennedy wanted Mrs. Kennedy to have a garden. And then when Mrs. Johnson came in and she invited Mrs. Mellon to the White House and she wrote about it in her diary, that it was a day that Bunny Mellon came to the White House and she was been looking forward to a very, very long time. And they walked around together and Mrs. Mellon shared a lot of what the Kennedys were trying to do, and Lady Bird embraced that and then asked her just to finish the East Garden. And then Mrs. Mellon wanted to name it after Mrs. Kennedy, and so Mrs. Johnson worked with her on that, and that went actually through Congress, and so it's technically the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden. And that's, legislative. Yeah. Those gardens can't be changed at all. Of course, there are gardens and gardens grow and do change, but for the most part, the structure has to remain as is. So it's a lasting testament, I feel, to Mrs. Mellon's thinking, to her design, her sense of history. She spent a lot of time studying the past, what had been done, and trying to incorporate that. Her biggest goal, though, was to give President Kennedy what he wanted, and it's still in use today. Yeah, the same plan. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about her vision for their estate before they passed, and what it's doing now and how and why?
Well, she, excuse me. She wanted her estate to benefit others, and so she created the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. That came into being after her passing, and a lot of the farm was sold, but she initially kept 225 acres, whatever was designated to remain part of the foundation. So, and her goal was, she was self-taught. She wasn't formally trained, and she was an avid learner, and I always thought of her as someone who had a trowel in one hand and a book in the other. And because she bought the books that she loved and that on the topic she wanted to know about, and she wanted to create that same atmosphere and make that learning accessible to others. And so that was her goal, is that others could come and learn and benefit from what she had been blessed with. And so that's the essence of the what goes on there today. But I'm not involved with Oak Spring, but Eleanor is, and you can talk to Eleanor or Tony about that afterwards. Yeah. Yes.
I've got a question from the simulcast. How long did her version of the Rose Garden at the White House last before it was changed? And
How long did Mrs. Mellon's version of the Rose Garden last? I would say that what she put in place with what President Kennedy asked for, he wanted it to be a traditional American garden. See, he'd gone to France with Mrs. Kennedy on a tour. It's their first tour abroad to Europe as the President and First Lady of the United States. And when he got to France, he was really impressed with Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle seemed to wrap himself in the beauty and essence of all things French. And he was able to promote his country in such a way because of the way he used the gardens and the architecture. And Kennedy got that. And he came home from August in June, and that by August he was knocking on her door. Well, he drove his boat down, and she had a picnic, and they had this picnic, lunch there at Cape Cod, and that's when he asked her to make this garden. And she was an amateur gardener. She never done anything like that, and at first she was a little taken back by it, but she said, I don't think you want to hire someone, a professional, and he just like blew it off. He just like, no, you're doing this garden. And so she said, okay. So she said she agreed to do it, but it took some time for her to come up with a plan. The lawn to hold 1,000 people, continuous blooming flowers of the season, steps. He wanted new steps, the steps that had been there with these old concrete steps. And it was very uncomfortable. He wanted more of a platform, a stage that opened out into the lawn. And it's perfect because the president will stand in the middle. Kennedy wanted to be able to stand low, down towards the guests. He didn't like being above them. So he would stand down with the people, and then the people he was honoring would stand above him. And so that's what he wanted, very democratic plan. And it's beautiful. I watched it many times, and it's still what they do today, whether it's a turkey or one time we had roses brought in that they gave to President Reagan. And all these roses were on that, Kennedy's platform. And so that was what he wanted. Jefferson and Washington were ardent gardeners, and they came into the mix too. They wanted to represent them, but they were practical. They wanted things, both those presidents, they wanted things to be beautiful, but they had to have meaning. They had to be done for a reason, not just to do it. So the garden is still, in essence, today, the way it was then, for the most part. Of course, things grow. I remember when during the Reagan years, those Katherines, Crabapples, kind of grown out, and they talked about pulling them out and replacing them, or Mrs. Mellon even suggested maybe there wouldn't be so many, but they ended up keeping them just as they were, and it was some time before I think they replaced them. But that's just what you have to do in a garden. Pruning is really important. She was an avid pruner. I think she spent most of her life with secateurs in her hand. She just loved to prune things. And so everything is manicured at the farm. The first time I went there, it's just exquisite, the way everything is manicured, and the way the tops of the trees would touch the sky in this pattern. And so even in the rose garden, that pruning was really important. And Mr. Everett Hicks was the arborist who came in and did that for her. He's the one who planted those Solangianas that they dug up, and they had the Park Service giving them trouble about these trees. They didn't want to put these trees in there. They thought it was too expensive. And one day, they just decided that they were going to do it in the dead of night. And so Mr. Williams and Mr. Hicks, they had these trees on hold, ready to go, and that's what they did. They moved them in, and Mrs. Mellon did a lot of gardening in the night, especially on Cape Cod. There's this spit of land called Dead Neck, and the gardeners tell these great stories, and they had these bonfires because they would take their boats back and forth across, clearing. She wanted this strip, the Dead Neck, to be totally cleared. She didn't like to see the brown or anything, and so they had to haul it. But up there, they weren't allowed to remove it. But they did in the night, and then they would these bonfires on the shore. So all these things were really very important to her. So but going back to your question about the rose garden, it's still the same plan, and I think it will stay that way for a very long time. You really can't improve on it. It's much prettier than it was before. Yes.
What did she do on her Caribbean property?
Oh, Antigua. What did she do there? They built the question is, what did she do in her Antigua property? They had a really interesting house that was built like a rancher, like one level, except the entrance you came in at one level and there were stairs down, but then everything else is continuous. And it was on the bluff, above the sea, and just beautiful, a view of the bay. And there were the monkey room was the room where they like a living room where they would gather, in the dining room. The dining room also had the same kind of walls that paneled, that opened, that concealed the shelving. And some of the old pictures I saw with the door open and you could see your tablecloths and things. And I thought that's so clever to, have walls that open and you can store and you don't even know what's behind them. But it was like a jungle atmosphere with plants of the island. And the gardeners that tended it were the gardeners from Cape Cod would fly down. She did have some people on site, but I know mostly the gardener in Cape Cod would go back and forth, maintaining the Antigua property.
That actually ties in nicely to the next question from the simulcast. Did she have any interest in sustainable gardening or gardening based on her geography?
Oh, yeah. Well, in Nantucket, that was a geographical and the Cape Cod geographical situation because of the winds and always knowing how to protect the garden from the winds. Nantucket had a hedge built around it. So she was always addressing locale, what grows where kind of thing. Sustainable garden, she was very much a woman, a future thinking woman. That was part of the foundation. She wanted people to continue to learn and develop, and what was new. Like Givenchy told me, he's like, we always wanted to, he said, you never live in your own time. He said, you must live, you never live in someone else's time. He said, you always want to keep living in your own time and moving forward with what's happening. He said, don't get stuck looking at what we did and think that's that. He said, no, you can bring that forward, but apply it to what is being learned, the thought processes of today. Oh,
I
yes.
just wanted to ask you one thing. We've seen her garden because we live in fairly close to there.
Okay.
But anyway, is any part of it open still
It is on occasion,
to the public?
not to the public. You have to get a special permission from Eleanor.
But it isn't, there is part of it still being kept open. Is it run by?
Eleanor, why don't you answer her question?
Is it run by the
It is not
foundation?
open to the public, but we do allow several garden clubs to visit,
Yeah, I think that's
scholars
right.
come and visit, so it isn't, we are restricted by the county, and even the Melons said in Mr. Mellon's autobiography, no yellow school buses. So he didn't want it to be open to the public, but Mrs. Mellon's library is open to scholars, and we run conferences there, so people do get in, but for reason.
It's in keeping with her, what she wanted it. It's all, people that are really motivated to learn and want to know more and can collaborate. Great place to collaborate, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
There's one more. Thank you.